birds. The story that I was told behind this was that the Prime Minister, who was trying to build a garden city, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, a rather severe kind of character, was developing his garden city, wanted to have a green city on the island, and a visiting dignitary said to him, "Well, I like all your trees, I like all your green trees, but where are your birds?" And being the sort of guy that he was, he said, "Find me somebody, I want to know where my birds are." So this was where I then entered the scene, and was commissioned with this task of bringing back the birds in some way. Now, of course, I guessed the birds were there. I guessed it was a lot to do with habitat, but I didn't really know how I was going to go about this problem. When I first went to Singapore, I was a bit of an oddity, and Singapore journalists are always very keen to interview oddities. So when they turned up at the Botanic Gardens and said, "I'd like to talk to you about birds," yes, okay. I talked to the journalists that came along. I didn't realize at that time I was a civil servant, and I didn't realize that civil servants were supposed to never be seen and never heard, but just get on with their job. So I did get myself into a certain amount of trouble for talking to journalists about the work that I was doing. And in particular, this one really created some storm. This was an article. Are you seeing my cursor there, Ellie?
Yes, and very nicely read.
Okay, that's good. So this article in particular got me in quite a bit of hot water, because this was the International Herald Tribune, and this is a cartoon of Lee Kuan Yew releasing birds from cages, you see. And you didn't make cartoons out of Lee Kuan Yew. You didn't make a joke out of him. So I almost got fired before I'd even started the job when this appeared. Now, for those of you that have never been to Singapore, which is, I'm guessing, probably the majority of you, just to give you a feel for what the place is like. Singapore is right in the center of Southeast Asia. Here we've got Thailand, Malaysia with Kuala Lumpur, where I'd been working previously, the Indonesian archipelago, wonderful area over here, and the island of Borneo, which is split into an Indonesian portion in the south, a Malaysian portion in the north, with little Brunei sitting in between. Now, Singapore is an island at the bottom, right at the bottom of the Malay Peninsula. It's separated, it's very close to Malaysia. It was part of Malaysia at one time in its history. It became an independent country in the 1960s. Very densely populated, and the city area in those days was in this area here, although it was expanding over here where you see a lot of grey, but does have some green areas. In the center there is secondary forest, which is the catchment area for the island's water supply, and over here where there are extensive mangroves. There are mangroves all the way around the island, but a big expanse of them here. Unfortunately, a lot of this was in a military live firing range, which made it very well protected, but I had difficulty getting in there to do any field work. As I say, I was charged with bringing back the birds. I didn't really know how to go about this. I knew that I was dealing with everything from rainforests that looked like this to urban parkland landscapes that looked like this. But I went back to basic ecological principles that I knew. Different bird species are adapted to different habitats. The more diversity in the habitat, the more diverse the resident bird species. the greater the biomass of the food supply, the greater the biomass of the birds it can support. I knew I was on an island. Islands are prone to extinctions, and the more isolated the island, the greater the effect. Now, as an island, I've just shown you it's very close to the Malay Peninsula, so it's not that isolated. But islands can also be geographic or ecological, and the island effect in Singapore with fragmented habitats was the major issue as I saw it. But we know that ecological corridors, connections, can ameliorate the island effect. So armed with these general principles, I got down to work, first doing some broad surveys. This is what it looked like. Now, I've got to go back to the title. One thing I've forgotten to tell you is that I started this work in Singapore in 1982. So I was using a state of knowledge of 1982 and a stage of technology of 1982. For those of you who perhaps weren't even born in 1982, this was desktop computers were just coming into being for the very first time. There was no such thing as digital cameras, and the internet had not yet, although it was invented, it had not yet become publicly available. So I'm making these rather lame excuses because this is a 1982 35mm slide of the forests in Singapore as they looked at that time. Mostly secondary forest because it had traditionally been cleared for timber and agriculture during British colonial times, but recovering, as I say, to act as a water catchment area. This is an island that gets 4 meters of rainfall per year, which is not excessive for some of you. I realize that. Another important set of habitats that I could see were agricultural areas. Some of them active agriculture, growing smallholders, growing vegetables. But others like this abandoned coconut plantation, which can become overgrown very, very quickly in the hot and humid atmosphere that are there. But I decided to pick these out as a separate category of habitats. Another important one was parks and urban greenery. This was the way parks were designed in those days. These trees that I used to call lollipop trees because it was like a bunch of leaves on the end of a stick, and not very much imagination applied to the design. Finally, the mangroves, very rich. I love mangroves. They're not easy to work in, but I love them. Very, very, very rich habitat with nice mudflats associated with them. And the thing about Singapore is there are 2 migration flyways. The whole of the peninsula is part of an important part of the East Asian flyway. But wading birds would tend to follow the coastlines, and because of the shape of the peninsula, they would be focused on Singapore. So wonderful numbers of wading birds from, well, we now know as far away as the Arctic Circle that would pass through Singapore every year. So there were my major categories, 4 categories of habitat that I had. And I chose myself 15 study sites spread around this habitat. And what I wanted to do was to look at what was there, what species were present, how many, what density of species were present, and could I identify what were the characteristics of the habitat that could account for the distribution of species as I was looking at them. I did very simple line transect counts. following a line and simply estimating how far a bird that I saw was from the center line, how far it was from the center line, looking at the distribution, and then with a little bit of mathematics, I could work out the density of different bird species. At this point in time, I'd already had some interest in wildlife sound recording from Malaysia, but understanding the songs and calls of Southeast Asian species was very, very important for me in doing this work at that time. This was the way I surveyed the birds. I can't remember exactly now. My transects were about 1.5 kilometers long. I walked them at a regular pace, the same pace for each one, etc., to make the data collection as systematic as I could. I also, as I say, I wanted to know what were the characteristics of the habitat that I could identify, and for this, we did vegetation surveys on the same habitat, on a grid, a randomized grid system, and measured a whole bunch of variables for vegetative characteristics. Now, I said earlier on that I wasn't a botanist, so I did need some assistance with this. And fortunately, the Botanic Gardens had a school of horticulture attached to it, and they were always looking for interesting projects for students to get involved with in their final year. And I was able to co-opt some of the students to be able to set up my vegetation surveys. I also looked at food supply. I looked at the vegetation surveys, told me something about fruit for frugivores, but I wanted to know about insects. So I set up sticky traps in the same grid system where the vegetation surveys were taking place, and we got estimates of the biomass of insects that were available during the surveys. So what this then meant was that I got a whole bunch of information on different aspects of the bird density and diversity with vegetation parameters, food habitat parameters that I could compare them with. I found that the mangroves had the highest density of birds. And interesting, the forest, the least density, and that is probably to do with the history of disturbance. Once this was the forests were an island in the middle of an island, and once things are driven to extinction there, they don't come back that easily in tropical rainforest. Rural areas, those overgrown farmland, had the greatest number of species. And parks, the least number of species. The parks were dominated by a very few common species. So there was few things in the parks, but what were there were very, very common. And diversity was the highest in rural areas, those overgrown agriculture, and in the mangroves. Although the forests had the lowest density, they did have unique species which were not found elsewhere. And of course, again, this is a characteristic of the specialization that you find in birds of tropical rainforests. So I could work out a bunch of indices like this for the species and begin to get an idea of the distribution of them across the island. I also did multiple regression analyses of all the density of the species against all the characteristics, either vegetation or food, etc., that of the data that I had collected. These were multiple regression data that I had. Took me a long time. Had to go to the university to find a computer that can handle the amount of data that I got and do the analyses. But it meant that for each species, this is for a common iora, I could make a story. I could say, well, here's a small canopy feeding insectivore negatively correlated with tall, large trees, positively correlated with the density of small and medium-sized trees and with the density of figs, and so on. So I could, for all the species that I'd found, come up with a rough description of what was going on. I could also, as I'd been observing and doing my surveys, I could begin to collect data on the plant species that were good for insects, fruit-bearing trees, for frugivores, which species were the nectarivores going for. There are no hummingbirds in Southeast Asia, but there's a very large variety of sunbirds who were take, and leaf birds and other things that take nectar. And so I could begin to look at how these habitat features, species features correlated with the birds that I had identified. And figs were the, if you want birds in Southeast Asia, plant a fig tree in your garden is the simplest advice I can provide. But the government had commissioned me to bring back the birds, and I now knew that I was where the birds were and so on. But I had to think about landscaping for birds. They had to be apparent to people. I had to make them feel as though these things had come back. They weren't going to come back, but if I could work out the right kind of vegetation management, then we would have a situation where people could experience birds. So I turned my attention for a while there to the urban areas. Now, remember, this was in the days way before rewilding was ever thought of as an approach. I started to think about how could the Parks Department begin landscaping for birds. So I would plan out a structured, in the old trees I described to you just then were, I call them lollipops because it was just a bunch of vegetation on the end of a stick. With empty space underneath them. Well, if you could fill in that empty space with medium-sized trees, and under the medium-sized trees, fill it in again with shrubs, then we're creating more bird habitat. So coming up with a structured vegetation pattern like this was what I felt to be the most sensible course of action. And then within a park, one could also design clumps of vegetation that were structured like this, with bushes or smaller trees that could connect them together, so that these didn't become islands within themselves. This was all well and good, but the people I was working for were very skeptical because all this looked rather untidy. It wasn't the non-ecologist view of a nice park or a nice garden. It sort of just looked a mess. But nevertheless, I didn't let that put me off. But I went then to look and think in terms of not just corridors within the parks. What about bigger corridors? What could we do looking at the whole country? What could we do looking at the whole of this island? Now, Singapore has got a very high population density. It's about 700 or 800 square kilometers in size. And today there's nearly 6 million people living there. Now, in the beginning of 1980, when I was doing this work, there was probably 3.5 million people living there. But nonetheless, this is a pretty high population density, and high-rise living was what was focused on. Demand for land was very, very competitive. And me turning around and saying, well, I'd like to have green corridors across the island, didn't get much sympathy from the pressures of economic development and the planners who were planning for that. But I then got to know that there was various things. There was railway tracks with spare land on either side. Most of Singapore is below 3 meters above the high tide level. I think 1.8 is the average height above the spring tide level. And so with 4 meters of rainfall in a year, there was a big demand for getting rid of the water that falls on the island to stop it flooding and getting that water back in the sea again or in the water storage reservoirs. So there was plenty of these very sterile concrete drains all over the place, some of which had suffered from erosion and began to look a little bit more like a natural habitat. So I thought, well, if I could get my hands on a few of these, I could begin to demonstrate what a green corridor might need. Now, I apologize again for the low quality of these pictures here, but these are taken from my final report, which I submitted in 1985, and color photocopying was not what it is today. So what I did was look at the whole of the island and map out where these major drainage channels were, map out where the forests were, where the major areas of mangroves were, and see if there was some way of joining together. This is the railway line that at that point went through the middle of Singapore. How could we make a network for nature within this area? The first thing I said is, look, we've got patches of vegetation. Let's save those patches of vegetation. And in other maps, I provided more detail of where these were, and then looked at these drainage canals and said, let's try and plant up the edges of these drainage canals to re-establish with native species some kind of natural habitat. People were not keen on that idea at all. And this was where then I began to enter the role, politics began to overtake the science. Singapore had a conscripted army, still does have a conscripted army. And all the young fellows used to have to keep fit for their service when they would go every 2 or 3 years for 6 months in the army. And so jogging was a very popular pastime. So by persuading them that they could build jogging tracks for the young soldiers alongside the drainage canals, I began to make a case that had some resonance with the decision makers in the government. I was also very keen to try and work with the natural areas. This was an area called Serangoon, the Serangoon estuary, where there was a mixture of mangroves and mudflats, prawn ponds, old fisheries ponds, and things like that. Very, very rich. I could count upwards of 50,000 and more flocks of things like redshanks and godwits that would pass through this area or overwinter in this area. And I was desperate to create a nature reserve there. I had contact with a rather famous British ornithologist and conservationist and artist called Peter Scott, who would visit every couple of years in Singapore. And so I said to him, look, would you help me make the case for conserving this area? So I got a foreigner involved. That wasn't appreciated, and my proposals for it were rejected. So this took me then into, and I've gone from science now, from bird surveys and vegetation surveys, into how do I get my proposals accepted? I realized that I had to engage people. The politicians listen to the people who vote for them. So through the Nature Society that existed, I formed a small bird group, and we started to have bird races where we go out and, compete. Yeah, I think you'll probably know the concept of a bird race. It was quite early in those days. And so I formed this group of people who were really interested. Having lost the battle for conserving the Serangoon estuary, I then went to a place called Sungei Buloh, which was an area of old prawn ponds, and made a case. And it wasn't me that put it forward this time, but I got the Nature Society to put it forward, so that as a civil servant, I could give my opinions on it later on. So the Nature Society put this forward. But I also had to reach out to these folks. I always had to make the public aware of the importance of nature. And the last time anybody wrote a book on the birds of Singapore was in 1927. So I was fortunate to come across an itinerant artist called Frank Jarvis. And between Frank and myself, we put together a new book on the birds of Singapore. Now, this became quite popular because, as I said, I hadn't been one for 60 years. And so I picked up on this popularity. And although I'd nearly got fired for talking to the media previously, I decided I'd got nothing to lose now. I'd done all my science, I'd written all my reports. Now I had to become a lobbyist. And so I spoke to as many journalists as I could. I did TV interviews, I did radio interviews. My book launch did a lot of good. And slowly but surely, this became popular amongst the people of Singapore, amongst civil society. And the powers that be decided they probably ought to listen to this and start looking into it. So this was our first attempts at landscaping with birds in mind. Instead of turning this into a concrete canal, we left it as a natural mangrove outlet into the sea. This is an awful lot cheaper, saved a lot of money. It's a lot more effective. And so people began to think, well, maybe this Englishman isn't so crazy after all. I was pleased that the Nature Society's proposals for Sungei Buloh, for the nature reserve there, took off and was approved. And this was approved in 1988, just at the time I decided I was going to leave Singapore. What was then important was to have a good second generation that could take over. This was my old boss, Tan Wee Kiat, who was a great champion of the work that I was doing. And he put together a team of people who could carry on. And in actual fact, they made later, some years later, they made a special department called the National Parks Board to implement my recommendations over the whole island. So what happened? Has it done any good? Well, in 1987, when I left, there was about 280 species of birds on the Singapore bird list, which by 2017 had grown to just under 400, 102 new species. Why was there so many? Why had the number of species gone up by 34%? Well, my bird book and digital photography had got more bird watchers involved in things. And I could account for maybe 40 species that had never been picked up before. There was a further 13 that were accidental occurrences, but about 50 species had been affected by this habitat conservation improvement that took place. And these were some of the change in species. But as much as that, as the number of species went up and is still growing today, there was a huge surge of interest in nature. And whilst my book in 1987 had been the first for 60 years, within a decade, we were seeing a whole plethora of new books that had come out, looking at different aspects of nature, but many of them starting with birds, if you like. And today, with digitization, the availability, these are digiscopes, digital cameras attached to telescopes, which people use. These are pictures taken from that same old prawn pond area at Sungei Buloh, the wetland reserve that we set up, which now has boardwalks, bridges. There are otters in these rivers. There are crocodiles in these rivers. Hornbills came back, and a team from the university put up nest boxes for hornbills. And in the city, the plantings, this is why I say this is a 35-year story, the plantings that were done in the early days are now mature trees. So we've got mature native trees, bridges that can take people through the forest canopy. This is a nature reserve in the central catchment area at a place called Bukit Timah, with good visitor facilities, which help to protect nature. You get everybody enthusiastic in nature. You've got to do something to protect nature from all the visitors. So that was what was going on there. The National Parks Board, this was the new department that got set up. Now reaches out, has an outreach program. The Nature Society with its website, of course, and taking out bird watching trips, and the Singapore Bird Group itself, that little group of people who would go out doing the bird counts, the competitions, are now producing apps that enable people to enjoy. The newspaper reports these days are not about this peculiar guy who's bringing back the birds. It's about how many birds. Gee, look at the nature that we've got in Singapore and what we can do with it. But for me, there was a rather special moment in time on a later visit to Singapore, when I was walking back to my hotel one night. We still have many more people. We still have high density housing, but I saw a pied hornbill sitting in a palm tree right next to somebody's balcony. When I was living in Singapore, pied hornbills didn't exist. They were extinct in the city. But those nest boxes, the interest that people had taken in them, the maturing of the vegetation in that nature network that we set up across the island had clearly taken effect, because I'd never seen a hornbill as tame as this, coming right in next to where people lived. But it takes time. 35 years in this particular case to go from gathering all that basic data, putting it together, making a plan, and then doing the politics to get the plan adopted. And it's no coincidence that after my experiences there, once I left Singapore, I went on to work with WWF. And that's what brought me to Switzerland, where I live now. I was the conservation director for the WWF International in the headquarters for many years after that. So that's my story. Thank you for listening. And conservation is not just about science, it's about a lot of politics as well. Happy to talk about it if anybody has questions.